right, we're going to get started again. Please continue to enjoy your lunch, and we're going to continue with our speakers. But it's been a great program so far, really enlightening. So we're going to start with our first keynote speaker, Governor Jack Markell, Governor of Delaware. And is he in the room? Oh, hi, Governor. Nice to see you. Governor Markell took office in 2009 as Governor of Delaware. Since then, he has won President Obama's Race to the Top competition for progress in public school reform and signed new laws to drive improvements in the economy, environment, and education. Prior to his term as governor, Markell was elected state treasurer in 1998, winning 3 consecutive terms, including his last re-election in November of 2006 with an overwhelming 70% of the vote. He's been recognized, all right. He has been recognized in Delaware and around the country as a leader promoting policies to help people achieve their economic potential. Governor Markell, it's an honor.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back if I don't use a microphone? Yeah. Well, it is great to be here. And the little booklet says I'm going to talk about education and innovation. And back in November of 2010, I went to Taiwan, and I met a woman who was raised in Taiwan. She went to the States for her advanced education. She spent a couple of decades in the United States working for a company in the pharmaceutical industry. And about 15 years ago, she returned to Taiwan to start a firm that does drug research, design, and manufacturing. She's very successful. And she said to me, she said, you know, the U.S. will always be #1 at innovation. But what are you going to do for jobs for all the people who don't have PhDs? And so in my mind, that is really the question of the day. And I think the linkage to Common Core is very much, is very, very clear. And I was pleased a few years ago. I took office in January of '09 as governor. And shortly thereafter that, I was asked to assume the role along with then Governor Sonny Perdue of Georgia and as the co-chair of the Common Core Standards Committee. And I was pleased to do that because in my mind, it was really symbolic and reflective of the need for all of us to be a lot more honest with our students about, and with our kids and with their families about what it's going to take to be successful. And here's what I mean by that. I'm actually going to use an analogy that Mark Markell used a few moments ago. I'm going to take it a little bit further than he did. It's a very similar analogy. He talked about the basketball, you know, shooting at the 10-foot hoop or the 9-foot hoop. And so the way I see it is what we've been doing in this country for a long time now is the academic equivalent of having our kids learn to play basketball by shooting in an 8-foot basket. And the issue is you can actually get very good shooting in an 8-foot basket. The problem is you then get into a game, and you're playing against players who are shooting at a regulation basket, which is 10 feet. And the reason I say that is because if every state's required under federal law to administer a state standardized test. Now these tests don't have to have anything to do with each other from one state to the next. They don't have to measure the same things, and they don't have to use the same measurement scale. And so what we end up with as a result is something that is akin to Garrison Keillor and Lake Wobegon, where every kid is above average. And the reason I say that is if you compare the scores on these state tests to the scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEPS, or what's called the Nation's Report Card, the scores on these state tests tend to be a whole lot higher than the NAEPS scores. And then what's even lower than that are the scores on the PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment. These are the international scores. And so when you tell a kid that they are proficient based on a test that's administered within their state's borders, but then they have to compete for college and jobs for students who are not from within their state's borders, you're not being very honest with them. And in my view, a dose of honesty is very much in order. And that's really part of what a Common Core relates to. Now in Delaware, the first thing we did is we came to this conclusion. The first thing we did is we said, all right, well, we're gonna raise the bar. And so we made the decision. We changed the scale, and we said to kids and their parents and teachers that you may have been rated proficient in the past based on a certain level of knowledge, But a lot fewer of you are going to be judged as proficient in the future. Not because you know anything less, but because we're going to be more honest with you about what proficiency really means in this economy. Now you can imagine that was not a very popular thing to do. You know, to literally go around, we had town hall meetings all over the state to tell families that we were raising the bar. Now we recognize, of course, that it's not enough to raise the bar, you got to lift the kids' game as well. And that's where Common Core comes in. That's where our new assessments come in, where we can actually track what kind of progress students make from the beginning of the year, in the fall, to the winter, to the spring. We never had that. Most states never really had that before. There was an end-of-year test where you could compare how this year's fifth graders did compared to last year's fifth graders, but you didn't really have an assessment that allowed you to measure what kind of progress kids are making while they're in a particular teacher's classroom. So we've got a new assessment. We are making much, much better use of data than we ever have before, and this is critical. No matter what business you are involved in, no matter what organization, my guess is if you are successful, you're successful in part because you do a good job of measuring your data. And that's not really been the world of education for a long time, in large part because good data has not been available. But now, with this new assessment, it is. And I have had the opportunity over the last 7 weeks or so to sit in 2 separate times with our superintendents. We have 19 superintendents in our state. They get together every month, and they sit together usually in groups of 4 or 5. And to see them now for the first and for the second time, sitting at their tables of 4 and 5 people, go to the wall, they've got an easel pad, and they go to the wall and they say, okay, here's how our district is doing. Here's how we're doing in 6th to 8th grade math, here's how we're doing in 3rd to 5th grade reading, high school, here's how we're doing with the high poverty population, students with disabilities, you know, all the subsets. And it's an eye-opener. And to hear them say, you know, we're doing really good, really well in our 3rd to 5th grade math, and here's why, because we're doing this, this, and this. We're not doing really nearly as well as we thought we were doing in middle school reading. And I'm surprised about that because we have all these activities going on. I thought those activities were working, but the data is very clear. The data is staring me in the face. It's not working. And so that means I better find out, because I just heard this other superintendent talk about how well they were doing in the same category. What is it that they're doing in their district that we're not doing in ours? And to hear those conversations is very, very powerful. And then what's even more powerful is when you take that data and you're not looking at it just at the state level, and you're not looking at it just at the district level, or even at the school level, but you're looking at it at the classroom level. And one of the things when I went around the state, and when our Secretary of Education went around the state, we asked teachers what it is that they were looking for in the next generation of educational improvement, which really became the basis of our Race to the Top application. One of the things that they said is they wanted more time to collaborate with each other. And so we've now set up every single teacher in Delaware several times a month, sits down for 45 or 90 minutes with 5 of their peers. And they're digging into what the data is telling them. And so twice in the last month I sat in with teachers. Once a fourth grade group of English teachers talking about their students who were struggling with the idea of context, clues, and reading. When they're reading something in a passage in English, how do they figure out what it means by some of the context words? And their kids were struggling. The teachers were doing some research to figure out what other schools were doing, what kinds of tools they had available, what worked. And then I sat in with another group of teachers whose students were struggling with the concept of adding fractions with different denominators. And they were digging into the data, figuring out what it meant and how they were going to intervene differently. And it's a new approach to education. And the Common Core is very much tied to this. And here's how I think about it. I have a, before I got into public service, the most interesting part of my career, at least interesting to me, was my time in the telecommunications industry. I was the 13th employee at Nextel. And I also spent time at Comcast. So I know something about the idea of interoperability. It's something that's very important for those companies that are represented here that are TechNet members. Interoperability is really important. It means you can use your device no matter what market you go to. It can mean lots of things, but it basically means you don't have to adopt a different set of protocols for your device, for your phone, whatever, to work. And so what interoperability means in the technology world, I believe Common Core standards means in the education world. And it's very important for people to understand, you know, in the political world that we live in today, there's so much consternation and angst about Washington driving everything, including education. Well, you know what? Common Core Standards is not federally driven. This is not something that the Department of Education said, here are the standards that we think that all the states ought to adopt. Common Core Standards was something that was really, it was a partnership between the chief state school officers and the National Governors Association. And so we've now got dozens of states that have agreed that it's important that A, we have standards which are internationally benchmarked and that are consistent across states, because and the best way of thinking about it is a military family. And when the military families move so often, and how much of a struggle is it for a military kid to go from one base from one state to another base in another state and trying to have to pick up when there's no similarity from grade to grade about what's being taught from state to state. And so that's the easiest thing. But frankly, it applies to the rest of us as well. That doesn't mean we ought not to allow our teachers to use their creativity and their professional training to figure out how to teach to the standard. But there's really no reason that students from one state to another, from one region to the other, we ought not to have higher, clearer, and frankly, fewer standards. It's not about more standards. It's about making sure the standards that exist are very clear and higher than what we've had before. So in my mind, the reason I wanted to come today is I think the whole premise of Common Core is incredibly important. It's not the only part of where we are with educational improvement in this country. I think the use of data and making sure we've got effective teachers and leaders in every classroom, in every school, going after the schools which are most underperforming. There are many, getting families more engaged. There are lots and lots of pieces of this. The Common Core to me is just incredibly important. I want to stop by and to say I'm grateful to all of you for taking the time to dig in this, and to dig into this, and to invest in it. I think there's some really exciting things going on around the country right now in terms of educational improvement. I think it's a process. There is no destination here. I mean, this is something we are going to have to get better and better and better. And that's what's so hard. And there are a lot of people out there who say, you know what, if we could just go back and do education the way it was done when we were kids, it worked well enough for us, it's going to be good enough now. It's just not the world we live in. Maybe it would have been fine if we didn't have so many other countries investing so much money and investing so much attention and other resources into their educational systems, but we do. And we see that, and many of you are related, in some form related to companies that have so many choices about where you're going to hire the next employee. And this is what it's all about. Our job, those of us who are governors, our job is really to make sure that companies decide to invest their next dollar of capital in our states and to hire the next worker in our states. The CEO of Gallup recently wrote a book about the coming jobs war. It says there are 3 billion people in this country looking for jobs. 3 billion people in the world looking for jobs. There are 1.2 billion jobs available. There are 3 billion people around the globe looking for jobs. There are 1.2 billion jobs available. We are in a global war for jobs, which means we're in a global war for talent. And it's my view that Common Core is a really important part of that equation. So I very much appreciate my chance to be here, and thank you all for having me.